Humans are designed for a world that no longer exists. The problem is short-term ease leads to long-term dis-ease. We've normalized what is patently abnormal. What that means is chronically fatigued, brain fog every day, really difficult time concentrating, needlessly grabbing my phone every 2 seconds. This is the singular question that you can ask yourself if you want to be healthy, is how do I design my life in harmony with my own engineering?
Back on the podcast for the third time is Jeff Krasno, the founder of Commune and the co-founder of Wanderlust, two of the most influential platforms in the modern wellness movement, and the author of Good Stress, which is a book about how discomfort can actually heal us. But before all of that, Jeff was a tired, overcommitted dad, burning the candle at both ends, struggling to read books and think clearly and make it through the day without crashing. And in this episode, Jeff shares how he slowly turned his life around and how you can too. You're going to learn how to reclaim your health in the most cost-effective way. You're going to learn why the body is designed for a world that no longer exists and what to do about that. How integrating simple physical challenges throughout your day can boost your energy and your overall health, and why real change often starts by removing what's not working instead of piling on more. Plus, we go into great detail around how to use cold plunges and diet and sleep in order to get into the best shape of your life, even in your 40s, 50s, and beyond. But first, let's start with cold showers and the surprising way they rewired how Jeff reacts to pressure. I'll put timestamps below if you want to skip around. Let's dive in. You oftentimes credit me with inspiring you to start squatting, doing the resting squat, which we can talk about. But you inspired me to get serious about cold exposure, right? You posted some stuff on social media of you taking these showers, and you were like talking as you were taking the cold shower. And you know, I'd done cold here and there, but I said, you know what? I'm just going to really go all in on this and confront my discomfort around this. It wasn't a fear. It was just, I just don't like being uncomfortable with certain things. And cold is one of those things. In fact, it reminds me of this off-color joke, which I don't know, maybe we'll cut it, but
we're recording.
somebody said that when the Titanic sunk, the people who died in that disaster were real healthy for about 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, yeah. There's a joke. I can't remember where I heard this one was. When you're healthy, you've got 1,000 problems. When you're unhealthy, you got one problem.
Right. But it just, it just kind of speaks to this idea that like nobody would ever want to be, obviously, die in freezing cold water. But now we're in a day and age where that's one of the recommendations of people who are in the wellness industry. So you got to expose yourself to more cold water. And I started doing that. I did that for a year. I did that for 1 year, from April 2024 to April 2025, took a cold shower every day. Not once did I look forward to it, but also not once did I regret it. After I was done with it, I always have this big smile plastered on my face. And it was just, I don't know, it was just kind of giddy getting out of the shower. So
I feel the same way. I look at my cold plunge with disdain every morning, with total annoyance. I side-eye it. I throw it tons of shade. And I say to myself, not today, just not today. I'm not going to do it today. The second I say that, that's my cue. Get in the fucking ice, man. Get in. And I do it every day. And like you, I never regret it. And it's not that I just don't regret it in the moment, because obviously it has immediate benefits. It makes you feel a sense of like alertness. Not even 5 shots of espresso might rival. But where I'm happiest is later in the day, when someone cuts me off in traffic, or, my kids, start annoying me, or life throws me a curveball. And I have that capacity to apply that top-down pressure on top of that bottom-up involuntary stress response and tame the wild tiger of what might be, really inappropriate behavior because I've built up this emotional resilience in the ice that then spills into the rest of my life. I can go on and on about the geeky physiological benefits and all the neurotransmitters and metabolic impacts and all that stuff. But the real impact, the most potent impact, is psychological with the cold.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll live our way into a point where people will say that cold is the worst thing you could do for your body physiologically, just like they did with goji berries and agave and all the other, wellness trends. But you can't deny the dopamine and the feeling tone that you get having pushed yourself in that way and stretched out of your comfort zone in that way.
Yeah. I think this is true with almost everything that you avoid.
Right.
And this is where the general thesis, I think, holds true, which is that there are benefits to doing hard things. And if you're avoiding something because it's hard, try to step back and witness that for a moment and imagine what's on the other side of that hard thing. And perhaps you want to lean into that discomfort. I find that's definitely true with time-restricted eating, with cold therapy, with resistance training, but certainly also with, other aspects of one's psychosocial life, with having conversations that you would otherwise really want to avoid, but then you have them and you're so much happier that you did.
Take us back, man, to before you started being intentional about diving into your good stress research. Take us back to the sleepless nights and the pre-diabetic lifestyle, and what was that like on a daily basis? Because what's surprising about you and your story is that you were the co-founder of a very popular wellness movement. So it's not like you didn't have the information. It's not like you weren't surrounded by people who were adopting these different wellness behaviors and whatnot. So if you weren't doing it, then it's like, what hope is there for anybody who's out here just surviving?
Yeah, well, I think we've normalized what is patently abnormal. So I was kind of the normal 48, 49-year-old dude. But what that means is I was chronically fatigued. I had brain fog every day. I was easily irritated, had a really difficult time concentrating, really hard time reading books, needlessly kind of grabbing my phone every 2 seconds. I had the dad bod, the extra layer of adiposity, inner tube around the belly. I had, the man boobs, et cetera. I had, all these artifacts of modernity that we've just accepted. But if you go back 100 years or certainly thousands of years to our hunter-gatherer ancestry, none of these presentations were ever on display, ever. So, what makes my story extraordinary is that it's actually totally ordinary. And then, when I realized that there was something deeper, the true deep metabolic dysfunction and prediabetes really bordering on diabetic blood sugar levels, then it kind of had a name, it had a diagnosis, and it was like, wake up, you got to change your life. But I think for so many of us, it's just all too easy to limp through life with all of those conditions that I just mentioned and never really address them, just write them off to having a bad day. And then all of a sudden, you're 60 or 65 and you have heart disease, or you get a stroke, or you have diabetes, or you get cancer, or fatty liver disease, or cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, et cetera. And you end up limping through the last 20 years of your life, managing all of these symptoms, often with cocktails of pharmaceuticals, but just never really enjoying what should be, the most enjoyable years of your life, where you might be blessed with children or grandchildren, et cetera. So this was my big wake-up call. And, fortunately, I had access to all of these brilliant people, and I just started interviewing folks and jumping into my own N of 1 experiment. And in that Petri dish, I learned a tremendous amount about physiology and the application of physiology on myself. And so these were the protocols, or what I sometimes think of as the tactics for turning my life around and transforming my health. But I think for a lot of folks, before you actually adopt the tactics, like the protocols, the time-restricted eating, the fasting, the cold water therapy, the sauna, the resistance training, you actually have to embrace the idea that change is actually possible in your life. Because so many of us, and this was true for me, you just become the story that you tell yourself about yourself. You become completely anchored to a false sense of identity. And for me, that was just like, I'm the fat kid and, I'll never, be totally accepted. I'll do anything to be liked. I'll grow my company as big as possible to feel a sense of self-worth. And most of that is written in the stars of my genetics. And there's really just nothing I can do. So I would say before even the tactics are deployed, that mind shift has to happen, that no, actually change is possible and I have some agency over it.
So what was there a moment where you had this shift, a wake-up call moment, like something specific that happened in your life?
Yeah, I think when I started to wear the continuous glucose monitor that I'm actually still wearing on my triceps for those people who are watching on video, which is a little disc that pings your blood glucose levels moment to moment to an app. I think for me, like staring into the app and seeing the data of where I was the wake-up call. Because the other aspects of my condition were so subjective. I was like, oh, I'm just not feeling great. I'm slow. I can't concentrate. Why can't I read this book? I don't know. I don't know. I ate too late last night. All the millions of excuses and different vagaries that you can apply just to a mediocre level of energy. And then I saw the data and I was like, wow, what you can measure, you can improve. I've got to improve this. And in a way that number that I looked at was a really good proxy for how I was feeling. And, I don't want to get too connected to the biomarkers or the metrics because I don't want to wake up and look at my Oura Ring app and have that be the ultimate arbiter of whether or not I got a good night's sleep or not. I want to be able to feel whether or not I got a good night's sleep. But it was helpful in the early days. And I did find that there was a pretty direct correlation between kind of all of these different things that I was wearing and began wearing and how I felt.
And talk about some of the first steps that you took in those early days after you started monitoring your glucose. And I'm just thinking about it in terms of, someone listening to this, and let's say they identify with all those symptoms you listed off. What are some of the first steps that one can take in addition to getting a copy of Good Stress?
Yeah. I would say the first thing is like, listen, we operated under a thesis of genetic determinism for most of the 20th century, right? That essentially like our fate was written in our genes. And if we were able to map the human genome, we would, all of the proclivities for disease would be revealed and everything to do with our behavior, morphology, et cetera. And then, we mapped the human genome and we discovered that we had a scant 22,000 genes, basically the same as a pig and a guppy and less than a grape plant. And, it was a head scratcher. And of course, this gave rise to this notion of epigenetics that our genes change expression in relationship to our environment, right? So, and this came along in parallel with neuroplasticity, which also suggested the same thing about the brain, that the brain actually changes in relationship to its environment, even later in life. We were taught in the 20th century that your brain stops growing neurons at age 25, 26, and it's sort of a slow decline into delirium and dementia from there. But then we discovered, no, that's actually not true. We also discovered that, we actually live within this holobiont, this cooperative environment with bacteria. Now we call that the microbiome, that's constantly turning over and changing. And all of these things have great impact on our human condition. And we're not fixed beings. Change is actually really the only thing that is on offer or available to humans. But what we call ourselves, anyways, is as much to do with the environment that we live in as it is some sort of pre-coding. And so that's, I think, the first wake-up call needs to be there, which is like, okay, I can adopt the behaviors and shape my environment to some degree to alter how my genes are functioning, how my brain is working, how I'm coexisting with 39 trillion bacteria in my gut and in every organ and in my aura, et cetera. And then from there, like, okay, once you really grok and accept that you can change your life, then you start to adopt and play and experiment with the practices and protocols. And given the fact that 93% of us are metabolically dysfunctional, 50% of Americans are either pre-diabetic or diabetic. Of that pre-diabetic cohort, 90% are totally unaware that they're pre-diabetic. So much of our sad, pathetic condition has to do with our metabolism, essentially how our bodies make energy, how they break down food and use oxygen as substrates for the creation of energy in our mitochondria, et cetera. And so that is the place for so many of us to start, is like, how do I make better energy? And, so you have to look at like the core inputs there. One is diet, right? Not just what I eat, but when I eat. So that's a whole big area of things to focus on. Then it's how I move and what I'm doing with my body throughout the day. So that's another big thing. And then how I'm sleeping. And then the last one is like, how is my mind actually functioning? To what degree am I able to emotionally regulate and manage stress properly? And those are really the four big buckets of areas to focus on. So we can go through them and take them one by one if you want.
Yeah, but first, I would love to just hear more about who you're speaking to. Like, I decided a few years ago that I'm speaking to people who identify as spiritual. So I offer certain biases and assumptions to that end, things that I don't really go into. You talk about metabolic health. Does that mean you're speaking to people who already have an appreciation for this concept of metabolic health, or are you speaking to?
I think it's more people that feel a sense of brain fog and fatigue. Because for me, those are the most obvious indications that you are metabolically dysfunctional, because you might not even know those words. You might not associate the way you feel with metabolic dysfunction.
Right.
But if you are chronically fatigued and brain fogged and have an inability to concentrate and maybe some extra deposition of fat, that's a pretty good indication that you have some form of metabolic dysfunction and that you need to focus there. And that's also my personal experience. This is where I really went deep in terms of how those systems actually work and what are the strategies to address some of the dysfunction.
So it kind of feels like you're driving with the emergency brake on energetically throughout your moments in your day. And it's just taking a lot of effort to just try to be present and show up for yourself. Yeah. So let's go through that. Let's go through some of those symptoms in the mental bucket. And what are some of the ways that people can implement the good stress approach to help to navigate that?
Yeah, sure. I'd like to preface the tactics with a broader philosophy here, which is that humans are designed for a world that no longer exists. We were wired for a life and an environment that didn't really change over hundreds of thousands of years, our Homo sapien ancestry, and then millions of years of our hominid ancestry. And those conditions included a good amount of what I tend to call Paleolithic stress. So we were designed and engineered for periods of calorie scarcity. That was just the nature of our reality. We were designed to actually endure fluctuations in temperature, cold and heat. We were designed to walk and walk and walk and to lift heavy things and to build structures and to gather firewood and, from time to time to sprint, generally against our will. And we were designed to live within community and cooperate. And so in many ways, this is the singular question that you can ask yourself if you want to be healthy, is that how do I design my life in harmony with my own engineering and then try to mimic some of those conditions in a moment in history where we've essentially denuded our lifestyle and culture from anything remotely hard. We actually have to now impose some degree of good stress. So, like, look around. I mean, you can order up any form of ultra processed calorie, in the palm of your hand in the next 30 seconds. Mm-hmm. We've made it that easy. We've made it so easy to be comfortable with digital thermostats that know that light loves it at 71 degrees. And, essentially you never really have to be susceptible to fluctuations in temperature. We've designed our lives generally to be pretty sedentary. We can just sit here behind a desk and make a living and never have to move or lift anything heavy.
What you're describing are all the markers for success in our society. This is what people are striving to.
That's exactly right. That's the problem, is that, short-term ease leads to long-term dis-ease. I mean, you basically just nailed it. Think of the portrait of ease. Think of what we're all going for. We're all going for, oh man, I'm going to work at my desk job all day so I can go home and sit in my lazy boy and stream video late into the night and order up some Chick-fil-A and chill.
I deserve it.
I deserve it in a nice 72-degree thermoneutral environment, right? With my big padded shoes and whatever. This is the portrait of success. And of course, these conveniences lead to some pretty inconvenient realities, which is like, we're sick as a society. And this is where, chronic ease breeds chronic disease, period. So now we actually have to self-impose some of these hardships, some of these kind of good stressors into our life to realign our lifestyle with our own biology. And so that's sort of a bigger way to think about the whole thing. And then there's these concepts of hormesis, this phenomenon where just the right dosage of stress confers a psychological or physiological benefit. Sometimes people call it adversity mimetics. Sometimes people call it eustress, etc. But really, it's just like the Paleolithic conditions in which we evolved, period. So what does that look like? Oh, a little bit of food scarcity from time to time. Now we can call that all sorts of things: intermittent fasting, OMAD, water fasts. There's a lot of different approaches to it. How many hours do I need to go before I get into ketosis or autophagy? There's all these kind of more bespoke aspects of it. But the bigger truth here is that we're stuffing our face virtually all day until we sleep. If you really are honest with yourself, and if this is, I had to be honest, I had to take an honest inventory of my own self. I was probably eating 16, 17 hours a day. Not every moment of the day, but from my first bite to my last bite.
Yeah, you're grazing.
Yeah, just totally mindlessly. And a lot of that is related to emotional dysregulation, right? So I'm bored. Something didn't go well at work. Someone insulted me. My life isn't what it should be. I don't feel good enough. Look at that dude. He got the New York Times bestseller list. So whatever it is, Trump, I don't know, whatever emotionally dysregulates you, right? And then just over there in the cupboard is some amazing bioengineered food to hit your bliss point. This little combo of fat and sweets and sugar and salt that's going to give you that dopamine burst and give you that ephemeral relief from whatever emotional dysregulation you're feeling, right? And that caustic elixir, that little combination between emotional dysregulation and the always availability of shitty food, that essentially is the one biggest thing that is contributing to obesity, diabetes, and chronic disease, in my mind. So
I would even go further, man, and just say the real culprit is capitalism. And I'm not an anti-capitalist, okay? But what I mean by that is marketing, right?
Yeah.
So you have brands called Nature's Own, and it's so hard to determine what's quotes healthy and what's not healthy if you're not if you're not in the LA, San Francisco, New York wellness scene, and you're not, you're not hip to all these different suggestions on how to read labels and how to tell if something's organic or not organic and things like that. It's so easy to kind of slip. I was in Erewhon once and I was looking at ice cream, and the big marketing plug for these ice creams is, oh yeah, this is 13 grams of protein. This is, that was how they were selling the ice cream, is as a protein delivery device. And it was like, man, if you're not more aware, this stuff can get you, because we're talking about overcoming a lot of discipline here.
Well, so capitalism, and you're right. I think, capitalism as a system has proven itself as potentially the best system yet to exist in terms of pulling people out of poverty and creating a bigger pie, et cetera. Obviously, the excessives, the unbridled dysregulation of capitalism has led to income inequality, but as we're specifically talking about, a lot of poor health. Because what it does is that it actually hacks our biology. It studies our biology and hacks it and uses it against us. So let's look at it, how that works. Yeah, let's look how that works. So Instagram or algorithmically driven social media, it knows how to tickle your human negativity bias, right? This old, ancient limbic system, or I should say, it's not really the limbic system, but anyways, it knows how to essentially hijack your amygdala for its own purposes to maximize engagement and watch time, to keep you in a state of constant dysregulation or fear or outrage or comparison or perceived deficiency, etc. So that's how that particular platform is using your own biology against you. And then you have big food that sits right there next to it that also is hacking your biology, that says, we know what's going to produce the maximum amount of dopamine and make you feel great for 10 minutes, right? So we're going to produce that food and make you want more and more of it. And so
advertise it on social media.
And everything, right. So we're going to trigger you, and then we're going to give you the antidote. But the antidote lasts for 5 minutes, and then you're on that hedonic treadmill again. And these are just whatever, 2 aspects of capitalism. You could just unfurl that flag forever. And so you're absolutely right. And this is where, you just need a bit of awareness to be able to manage everything that the world is throwing at you. You need, back to where we started with this conversation, discernment, right? You need to cultivate space between stimulus and response, period. You need to be able to recognize when you're triggered and then emotionally regulate instead of grabbing the bag of chips or the protein-rich ice cream. And this is the biggest challenge that we all have, because these systems are so powerful that you essentially need to be the Dalai Lama to be able to recognize their ubiquity.
Or move David Goggins into your house, like Jesse Itzler, and walk you through your day.
Right, yeah, just hire a monk. Maybe that's the next service available on your iPhone.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I think about, honestly. As we said in the beginning of this conversation, the information is there. If you're even have one foot in the wellness industry, you kind of know, I need to eat more whole foods, should stretch myself mentally a little bit more, I should get my sleep in order, stop scrolling in the middle of the night, et cetera, et cetera. But we're grappling with our primal psychology, and it's very, very difficult to do these kinds of things on your own. And so when it comes to baby steps, Jeff, what are some baby steps in the direction of implementing more of this good stress into our life that have been successful for you and others that you've talked to about this?
I think they're all baby steps, because the worst thing you can do is get into a 34-degree ice bath if you've never gotten cold. Right? Or go run a marathon if you've never run, or try to bench press 400 pounds if you've never bench pressed 80 pounds, right? So, and this is how you wind up habits. This is really this is how you entrain yourself day over day. It's like Alan Watts used to say he would try to stop drinking every once in a while. I don't think he ever succeeded with that. But he was like, you never say, I'm going to stop drinking for a year, right? Because then the devil knows and he shows up. All you need to say is, I'm just going to stop drinking for today. I can just get it done today. And then you keep the devil at bay, right? So it's all small steps. So if you're honest with yourself and you do this biopsychosocial intake form, right? And you say, oh, actually, in reality, I'm eating 17 hours a day. Tomorrow I'm going to eat at 10 and I'm going to take my last bite at 7 or 7:30. I'm going to start there. Just start there, right? And you can move yourself quite quickly into what is known as a 16-8 intermittent fasting protocol, which I don't think is that difficult for many, many people. This isn't perfect for everyone, particularly women on their cycle. There's certain different times, certainly better during your follicular phase than your luteal phase and all this stuff. But I think mostly it's like the bigger idea is like, we shouldn't be eating all day. In fact, even if you just consume all of your food in a 12-hour window, that is a really decent place to be. And so I think it's like winding up that habit, like getting outside in the morning, and making that a non-negotiable part of your life. It's not asking too much of you, but until you start doing it every day, and you make it that thing, it's just like, that's what I'm going to do. And that is what I do. I get outside every morning within 20 minutes of waking up. I'll have a little sip of espresso and I'll just stare at the trees and the cat bounding around and the birds and listen. And that's a form of kind of mindfulness and meditation, just being sort of aware of your surroundings, being quiet, setting your intention, but also getting really key morning light in order to set your circadian rhythm. And since I've started doing that, my sleep patterns and my flow, my balance of hormones between cortisol and melatonin have gotten really optimized. And I feel so much better, right? And these things, you begin to stack these little habits that seem stressful at first, and then they just literally become a part of your life. For example, let's talk about movement, because there's so much conflicting information around like how we should exercise, right? Some people are like, oh, all you need to do is lift. Other people are like zone 5 people. Other people are like, no, all you need to do is walk. And so again, I just ask myself like, well, how did I evolve? And then I try to live, within the parentheses of my evolution. Actually, it's funny. I was thinking about this the other day. Sometimes I call it my Jesus protocol. My Jesus protocol, 40 days in the desert, fasting. Yeah, maybe have like a little fish on Fridays. By Saturday, I'm totally dead. Sunday, come back to life again. And I call that Jehovah's Fitness. Anyways, you can have that one. But so if you ask yourself, my ancestors, they walked like 7 to 10 miles a day. And they didn't do it in a blob at the end of the day on a Stairmaster, right? So, like in modern day, we tend to productize everything, including our own exercise. There's so many of us are like, oh yeah, I'm going to hit Equinox or my gym from 5:30 to 6:15, get some chronic cardio in, and that'll expiate me of all my sins and, whatever, then I can go home and have a beer. But that simply just does not work, because that is not how we evolved. You need to integrate movement throughout your entire day. And, that might be, instead of making an hour phone call or conference call, 45-minute phone call, and then go walk for 10 minutes. It might be just walk after every meal. It might just be dropping and doing 10 air squats or 20 push-ups kind of within the context of your life. It's the winding up of those kinds of things that will make the biggest difference over time.
But Jeff, it's so easy for you to say you exited from your company and you have this charmed life and, you have everything set up.
But nothing that I just said requires any amount of dollars. Anybody can, not anyone can do 10 pull-ups, but anyone can make the attempt to move or walk, most anyone, throughout their days. People can, work at a standing desk. People can get a headset and walk around while they're on their phone. There's tons of things. Fasting actually saves you money generally. Like getting cold under a cold stream of water, almost everyone can do that for free. You have a water bill, yes, but almost everyone can get cold. You can lift heavy things pretty much for free, right? You can get morning light, unless you live at high latitudes in the winter. You can get morning light or buy a $10 sad lamp on Amazon, and that's basically free. So many of these things, I mean, this is very different than like ozone therapy and cryo and hyperbaric chambers and AI powered rowing machines and, having the functional medicine concierge person. And like, that's all true. That stuff is all expensive, but that's not really the stuff I concentrate on. It's like the basics, and the basics tend to be available to most people.
Yeah. And I think the addiction model probably works really well too, which is you keep doing what you're doing and you keep experimenting with how it doesn't result in the type of outcomes that you ultimately want. And then when you get to a point where you just get tired of being tired, then what I get from your work is that and this is where we tend to go wrong. We tend to take on too much too quickly. And then we burn ourselves out thinking, oh, it doesn't work for me. Walking doesn't work for me because I didn't do 10,000 steps. I can't do that every day, but you don't have to do 10,000 steps. Just do 1,000 more steps, which is 10 minutes more of walking than you normally do. Start with that and just do 30 seconds of cold and then go back to your hot shower, and you can take 15-minute hot shower, but you started with those 30 seconds of cold and just take it in little bite-size portions in that way.
Yeah. Lean into the very edge of your discomfort. And this is really, this is the great Paracelsus quote, the dose makes the poison. Like some forms of deliberate hypoxia, for example, are really beneficial. Too much hypoxia, the podcast is over. We're dead. That's it, right? Too much fasting, you're going to waste, right? But the right amount of fasting triggers all of these pathways and keeps you lean, et cetera. So really, I think that is, a guiding light. The dose makes the poison, and just lean into the very edges of it. The best protocols are the ones that you're actually going to do. If they're too outrageous and too onerous, you're not going to do them. And so, stack up these little habits. It's just, I know it sounds glib, or trite. Just take the stairs. Take the stairs. Like, that's it. Do the little things that you would otherwise avoid. And then you start to make those decisions over and over again. And it feels empowering. It feels like you have some agency of your life when you're doing that.
Hey, if you've been knocking your head against the wall when it comes to daily meditation, falling off the wagon, getting back on, not quite sure if what you're doing is working, don't worry, I got you. For a limited time, I'm giving away my signature 7-day meditation kickstart for free to you, my podcast listeners. Plus, you'll get a free 2-week all-access pass to my entire Happiness Insiders online curriculum of challenges and masterclasses, which will provide you with a crystal clear roadmap for mastering your inner work. You'll also get support directly from me and accountability and a place to ask questions. And you can join me live for a meditation on each of your 2 free weeks. So with zero cost to you, you can get a daily meditation practice that you'll actually enjoy and look forward to doing for the rest of your life. And you'll have me to personally support you and hold you accountable. And after your 7-day meditation kickstart ends, you can start the 108-day meditation challenge and get even more support. And you can take as many other inner work challenges and masterclasses as you can fit into those 2 weeks. We have an unheard of 80% completion rate for our challenges, which is over 20 times higher than your average online course. So if you've been feeling stuck and inconsistent when it comes to your inner work practices, you will not find a better solution anywhere online. Go to thehappinessinsiders.com and let's get your meditation practice up and running today. That's thehappinessinsiders.com, and you can tell that nagging daily stress to kiss your ass. I'll put a link below in the description. Can you go into more detail around some of the tangible symptoms that you experienced in your life? You mentioned that you didn't sleep very well and brain fog and all that. What were some moments after you started intentionally integrating more of this good stress into your life where you realized things were turning around, or we could call them quick wins that you had? And what was sort of the timing of it all?
Yeah. Well, I lost a lot of weight.
You were
So I
210
was,
at the heaviest, right?
yeah, 210. And then I kind of overshot the mark. I went down to 142. And that happened in a relatively condensed period of time. I would say 4 to 5 months. So,
That's a
of
lot.
course, people were all, oh, you're sick. What's wrong? All that stuff. I was like, I feel great. I actually loved being that lean because I felt so light. But then subsequently, I've just tried to focus on putting on muscle. But
How tall are you, Jeff?
just like a smidge over 6 feet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just so we get the proportion. So where are you now, weight wise?
Yeah, I'm like 165, 167, some in there. So
you dropped to
and I have
142 from intermittent fasting?
so this was like the power stack. If weight management's a deal for you, then here's the power stack. Okay. Intermittent fasting. So for me, that was consolidating all my consumption of food in an 8-hour window. Right. So yeah, you can consolidate your time window. It doesn't necessarily mean you're actually lowering your caloric intake, but generally you are, because once you start making conscious decisions about your eating patterns, you're making other conscious decisions. So then I adopted a keto focused diet, mostly what I call ketotarian, because I was eating a lot of fiber as well, but low carb, high protein, good healthy fats, but low carbohydrate. So basically, I was giving my overtaxed pancreas a little bit of a break from producing its product insulin, which is an anabolic hormone. So I was keeping my glucose levels low, right, through intermittent fasting and through a keto-focused diet. And then when I layered cold plunging in on top of that, that's when I saw the real weight loss acceleration. And that makes sense if you start to understand the mechanisms of it. So I would get into a cold plunge at a very specific time of day, which would be before I took my first bite of food. So before I broke fast, I would get really, really cold. And if you think about it, you'll understand why that worked. So I would get into the cold plunge. My core body temperature would plummet. My body would then look around for an energy substrate to make heat, right? To warm myself back up into that little warm porridge of 98.6, the Goldilocks zone. And it would look around, and because I was fasted and had a low carb diet, there was no glucose or very little glucose around to use as that energy substrate to make heat. So it had no other choice except to oxidize fat, to break down fat and use fat as energy to make myself warm. And the combination of those three things, the intermittent fasting, the keto diet, and the cold plunging at the right moment of the day, I just saw a tremendous amount of weight loss.
So let's double click on the cold plunge thing, because I've got questions for you to optimize the experience, which goes by very slowly when you're in it. When you say cold plunge, you mean a cold shower, right?
Well, I'm fortunate enough to actually have a tub.
Okay, so you have the actual tub. Got it.
Yeah, so I can temperature regulate. But cold shower will work just as well. There's just not as much data around it because the experience of itself is so variable because you're getting pelted by little
So one
streams
question
of water.
about the shower, because I've run this experiment for a year. And when it comes to lowering the insulin and the body burning fat and all that good stuff, is it important to expose just a part of your body to the cold? So for instance, if you're standing with your back against the stream, right, but the front of your body's not really getting wet, or do you have to be a rotisserie and expose your whole body and your head? Because I read some study that's saying just put your head in cold and that's acceptable. And also there's only a certain amount of cold that your shower will turn to. So if it's not as cold as like having a tub full of ice, does that still make a difference?
Yeah, all good, great questions. So cold is very subjective. So as long as it feels cold, it will confer the benefit, right? So for some people, that could be 58 degrees. For other people that are super acclimated to the cold, could be 40 degrees. But you can get benefits from 58, 60 degree water for sure. In terms of, do you need to be be on one of those rotisserie at like a Middle Eastern restaurant? You can be like a little light kebab. No, you just need to lower your core body temperature for the metabolic benefits. And, one of the reasons why people say, you can do it with your face or with your hands or with your feet is because the surface area per volume is very high there, right? So you don't have a lot of volume, you have a lot of nerve endings. And so you're going to get cold quicker. So if you are limited, you don't have a cold plunge or the shower is not the option or whatever, you could, for example, fill a bucket of ice with ice water and just get your hands and your feet in it. And that will lower core body temperature. Because really that's what you're activating. You're activating thermogenesis, your body's ability to make heat metabolically to warm yourself back up, because we're all engineered for homeostasis. It's quite incredible how the body is designed for this dynamic balance that we call homeostasis.
How long, ideally, do you have to expose yourself to this in order to get the optimal benefit?
Yeah, I mean, the data seems to point to 3 to 4 sessions per week for a total aggregate of about 12 minutes. I'm not sure how stringent that data is. I would say that anywhere between 90 seconds and 3 minutes to really get your core body temperature down will probably do the trick. And again, you can start slow. It's like most people just start with getting cold at the end of a shower. And you do want to finish cold if you want the benefit. So getting cold and then turning it back to hot doesn't really help you that much. And if you really want the benefit, don't dry off. Like finish cold and then don't dry off. Let yourself shiver. Because if you think about it, that's the built-in mechanism that we have.
There were no towels
back
100,000 years ago when you got out of the river.
That's right. Like we have a built-in mechanism for dealing with cold. It's called shivering. We have a built-in mechanism for dealing with heat. It's called sweating, perspiration. So we have the mechanisms already built in. Thing is, when we don't use those mechanisms, we tend to lose them and we become more susceptible to cold and heat. So this is the ironic thing is, in order to foster good balance and homeostasis in the body, you actually have to push the body's edges a little bit. But it's like anything, you need to practice, you need to refine the ability of something to do it to hold on to that skill. And that's true with the body as well.
Well, I think you probably sold a lot of people with this dramatic weight loss that you experience.
I mean, the weight loss is something that is like, because it's so tangible and we're such a visually oriented society that, for better or worse, the beauty standards that we've created culturally tend to reward people that are slim. And so we, psychologically glom onto that. And weight management is part of the whole deal. But what I subsequently found, which is why I actually put on weight, is that muscle is huge. It is such a big determinant of health, and lack of muscle is such a big determinant of all-cause mortality, that just being really, really skinny doesn't mean you're really, really healthy. In fact, what you really want is good, lean muscle mass, low body fat.
I have one more quick question about the cold before we move on. I noticed that when I was doing this, naturally your breath becomes dysregulated. And I'm wondering, now that you say that you want to be cold and shivering, should you just let the breath be dysregulated, or should you breathe in a certain way in order to increase the effects that we're going for?
That's funny. Yeah, it's funny because like the Wim Hof breath, right, which tends to be like a hyperventilation sort of breath, is not
meant to warm you up, right?
Yeah. And well, it's also a sympathetic nervous system inducing breath, which is not what I would actually advise when you're in the cold plunge trying to emotionally regulate. What I would say is in the cold plunge, you're going to want longer exhales and some breath holds, because what you're trying to do is move yourself from that sympathetic overload back into the parasympathetic. And you're going to want to do that by extending your exhale and maybe doing some holds in between. So like a 4-7-8, like Andrew Weil breath pattern or something, it would be, I think, more appropriate if you're trying to emotionally regulate in the cold plunge. I mean, that's certainly what I do is, a hold for 4 to 6 and then a longer exhale. And, you're just trying to...
Does it matter nose, mouth, or just...
Well, I think you always want to inhale through your nose for a whole bunch of different reasons. It's a natural filter. It's also a kind of vasodilator because of the nitric oxide produced. And then, it will also, it's like a temperature control mechanism. So I would say in almost all cases, you want to nose breathe. I always think the nose is for breathing, the mouth is for eating. Except when you really, really cannot get enough oxygen in through your nose, then I would default to some mouth breathing. And if you're in like a very, very extended zone 5 state where your heart rate is like 90-95% of max, and you just can't get enough oxygen in for any aerobic respiration or energy production, then, sure. But then, I mean, you see this with like Novak Djokovic, right? With a tennis player, like after a long rally, you see what he does, right? He does a big nasal inhale. And I don't get into the mouth taping thing, but a lot of people do. And right. I think for some good reason.
Hey, really quickly, if you like this content or if you don't like it, let me know down in the comments, because your likes and comments are going to help me learn what you want more of. And then that way I can keep bringing you the good stuff. All right. Thanks so much for your feedback, and back to the show. So let's talk a little bit about the ketotarian fasting diet. Obviously, people can start off, with a 14-hour eating window, and then a 10-hour, and then a 9-hour, and then make their way up to an 8-hour over several weeks or months if they want to. But let's talk about, my questions about this are, can you shift those hours around depending on your schedule? Like, let's say you have a birthday party or something and you don't mind doing the 8 hours, but you need to push it a couple of hours versus what you normally do. Can you take weekends off? And I'm just asking these questions in terms of so that people can understand it. Is there any flexibility to this? Or once you lock in on the time, that's the time, or if you don't stick to that time, you're not going to have the effects?
Oh, I think you can have the effects, but the body does like the routine. And but here's the thing. It's like, if you wanted to be fundamentalist about this approach, you'd probably eat from like 9 to 5. Right? That would be the ideal window, because your body is more optimized to metabolize food earlier in the day. But that sounds very unfriendly.
Right. I mean, Jeff, I have to go to work. I'm working from 9 to 5. I don't have time to fit all the meals in between my phone calls.
Yeah, I'd never eat with my kids. I'd never go out to dinner with my friend. Mm-hmm. And, this can lead to a sort of counterposing condition known as orthorexia, which is a real deal, which is just an unhealthy obsession with food. And I know some people that are like that like I can never go out to dinner with because like it's outside their eating window, or I can never go to an Italian restaurant with because there's nothing on the menu they can eat and stuff. So, that for me is, if you start becoming neurotic about it, I think you're undoing any positive impact because you become so stressed out about the whole thing. So, I would say always maintain some degree of flexibility. That being said, the body does like routine. The body probably would do best if I just ate between 9 and 5 every day. But then, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. I'd be giving up so much of my social life, and I'm just not willing to do that. So I think this is where, you've got to find intelligent balance in your life where you say, okay, I'm going to go for it on the weekend. I got a friend in from college. We're going to go out. We're going to have a good time. We're going to go hear some music and maybe have a beer or something. And that's fine. But then like the week comes back around and you get back on your horse, and you start to get back into your adaptive habits. So, but yeah, I think there are some better patterns than others, and life is life. We try to do the best we can.
Also, if you, and you can relate to this, if you have a family, if you have kids and a wife, and they're not necessarily interested in adopting these protocols, then it becomes that much more difficult to fit it in. If you do like to share meals with your family, there's a lot of unregulated eating times. But I guess what I hear you saying is that even if you just did it 2 or 3 times a week, it's better than just being completely unconscious around when you're eating and your diet. And over time, you can sort of train yourself based on the feedback that you're getting on those days when you do regulate yourself a little bit more. There's a cumulative effect that will eventually add up, and you'll start to notice more and more. Like right now, I don't drink alcohol. I stopped drinking for the most part when I was 26. So it's not that I never drink it, but if I do happen to have the occasional mezcal or something like that, I feel it almost instantly. If I do happen to have a slice of that, processed birthday cake from Albertsons that I used to love when I was a kid, and I never really felt the negative side effects of it as much. Now, if I eat one of those pieces of birthday cake, I'll have a headache for like 4 days. I'll be foggy, and just off.
Yeah, sometimes I worry about that for myself because I become so susceptible to, some of these toxic inputs that it in some ways precludes me from ever having a quote unquote good time, because I'm paying such a dear price for them. But yeah, I think the key here is not to be neurotic, I think, which is, it's an easy way to go. I also think people need to be honest with how acute their situation is. Like when I first started, I was pretty fundamentalist. Like, I would sit with my kids for dinner, but I wouldn't eat, or I would eat very, very light, or I would eat different things than they were eating. And that had to happen until I began to come out of my acute phase. And then I became more metabolically flexible. Like I could shift more easily between burning different substrates for energy, and my metabolic baseline just reset. I was just operating more optimally. So I was metabolizing food better. I was digesting food better. I put on a lot more muscle. Muscle is just a glucose vacuum. So you can just even at rest, muscle is going to be sucking up sugar from your bloodstream. And so that's one of the, if you have blood sugar issues or you're pre-diabetic, one of the best things that you can do is get in the gym and lift some heavy things, because muscle is going to be a regulator for that.
What would you recommend as 2 or 3 recommended lifts that can give you the biggest bang for the buck? Obviously some sort of compound.
Yeah, compound stuff. For me, it's not all, but primarily body weight stuff, because I can do that pretty much anywhere. I have an annoying amount of pull-up bars in my house. But I'm always looking, I'm like that embarrassing dad on vacation that's always like scanning the city streets for scaffolding. It's like my kids will just like run across the street. They're like, oh no, dad's about to do some pull-ups on some scaffolding. But yeah, pull-ups are kind of my go-to. That was my early go-to, was I got on the 100 pull-ups per day train.
Were you able to do pull-ups before all of this? Like,
no.
What was your journey with pull-ups like?
Yeah, so this was like an axe to grind for me personally, because this goes back to my tortured youth. But I think we're in a similar generation. So when I grew up, we had the presidential fitness test.
That was the worst day of my life.
Worst day of my life, man. Because I had to lie. Because, some people were going for presidential level, whatever. So I was just going to standard. I was shooting
to get through it.
I was shooting for standard, like lowest common denominator. But lowest common denominator required that you do 1 pull-up. One, right? I couldn't do 1 pull-up.
Jeff, they never trained us to do a fucking pull-up. It's like we're standing out there with our street clothes on, and then no one has ever. I never took any pull-up lessons. Didn't know anything. It wasn't until that day where they said, "Okay, now it's time to pull yourself up." I'm like, just dangling there, hoping my good intentions can help me get up to.
Yeah, I would just jump up and use whatever momentum I could to just put my chin up parallel to the bar and then come back down.
Standing there looking at you.
Yeah, and then for me that was like 1. That's good enough. And then 1 year, it was like 4th or 5th grade. I had a really mean old gym teacher, Mrs. Brody, and she was like going through the little sheets, the little pamphlets at the end of the gym session. And she's like, "Oh, Jeff Krasno says you've done 1 pull-up." She's like, "We'd like to see you do that pull-up." She called me out. I had to come out in front of the class and hoist myself up and just kind of like rub the bar and whatever. It was obviously an incredibly embarrassing moment. So this was my axe to grind. So yeah, whenever I started this 4 or 5 years ago, I was doing the same technique, jump up and get the momentum and do 1. And then 1 became legit. And then 1 became 3. That was a big hurdle. And then 3 became probably 7. And then I got up to 20. And I could do sets of like 20, 18, 16, 14, 12, 10, 8. That was kind of my go-to for a while. And it's such a tough body weight exercise because you have to kind of get your body up to that number. But once you do, it's almost like the only thing you have to do if you're in a pinch and you don't have a gym, because it requires so many muscles, and you can engage your core, and there's different techniques that you can use. But there's also just something psychological for me about being able to lift my own weight. And I just love that feeling. And, I do it with trees or moldings or whatever, anything that I can find. So that's a good one. I think just getting into the air squats is the other one, because again, you can do it anywhere. And for me, like my whole musculature of my legs just completely turned around from that. And obviously credit you probably more than you like for that. And then just push-ups. Those are the 3 bodyweight ones that are just pretty much available to anyone at all times. The pull-ups can be a little bit difficult sometimes, but if you don't have a bar. But yeah, I mean, those 3 will take you such a long way. And, when I have days where I'm busy, or like I was in Europe for 3 weeks, I was like walking like crazy every day and just, doing those bodyweight exercises because I was busy. I wasn't hitting the gym every moment. And I held up great.
Let's talk about, we'll just have a few minutes left. I want to hit sleep.
Sure.
I know you've had some struggles with sleep. I remember seeing an interview with this sleep expert. She was a doctor. They interviewed her in her sleep lab. And at the end of the interview, after she gave all this data about how horrible people are sleeping, the interviewer goes, "So how do you sleep at night?" She says, "Terribly."
Yeah.
And the interviewer goes, "Why do you sleep? Out of all the people in the world, you should be having this amazing sleep." She goes, "Because I know the importance of it. And so I get anxious about that and I'm not able to sleep at night." So sleep is like that one thing where the more you focus on it, the less you're able to do it. So how do you crack that, Jeff?
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. Wisdom is taking your own advice sometimes. And I mean, there's all the kind of the checklist for good sleep architecture, right? So morning light, get some exercise during the day, but not too late. Get your body warm in the evening, actually. And that's a little anti-instinctual, but if you take like a hot bath, for example, or a sauna, your body is going to start cooling itself down. And really, you actually want to get down to maybe, 97 degrees, more or less, core body temperature for optimal sleep. So, we tend to think that like we're always at 98.6 and that's where we should always be. But that's actually not true. When we're sleeping, we want to go lower, and we can actually start that activity of lowering our body temperature through getting hot. So it's actually, and this is why people, they take warm baths before sleep, and sometimes they credit the magnesium and the Epsom salt, et cetera. But I think it's a lot to do with body temperature and body temperature regulation. There's also like the cool room, right? So keep your room like 60 to 64 degrees. You can also marry a wasp like I did, and she just doesn't believe in temperature control. So it's like cold in our room all the time. And then, like obviously if you can afford blackout curtains, great. But, just amber light in the inferior field. That's the best thing you can do. So even now they make LEDs that are amber, and you put them down kind of below eye level. And and obviously stop eating. If you can stop eating by 7 and go to bed at 10, last bite of food 3 hours before your head hits the pillow, that's a good one. And then there's like a lot of the breath work and journaling, reading tends to really, really help. I mean, reading is great because it takes your mind off any of the anxiety that you might have about falling asleep. So you can get engrossed in Moby Dick or whatever you want to be reading. And before you know it, you'll be out. So those are some of I think the basic techniques that or architecture that I think are pretty popular that a lot of people talk about. I think then, but what you point to is really psyching yourself out around sleep, which I totally can relate to, because there's this, you start to stack bricks of anxiety of I'm anxious that I'm not going to sleep. And now I'm anxious about the feeling of anxiousness about that I can't sleep. And then and then I'm anxious about the anxiety, about the anxiousness. This pertains to more than sleep. We are generally responsible for much of our own anxiety and suffering in this very manner. So this is where the adoption of mental exercises, such as meditation, I think can be really, really helpful, because it's nice to be able to slow the fluctuations of the mind and witness phenomena and thoughts and feelings and emotions arise moment to moment while you're on that cushion. Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. But where it's really helpful is off the cushion, right? So, and I think that's where it can be really helpful for sleep, where, you can actually witness that anxiety with a degree of non-judgment and equanimity and say okay, that's that feeling. And that feeling is simply going to subside in consciousness, and I'm not going to attach to it. I'm not going to identify with it. And now I've bored everyone into sleep, so including myself.
What about that dreaded moment, Jeff, when you wake up when your eyes open at 2 or 3 in the morning? What do you do? You've obviously already been disrupted, maybe it's from cortisol, whatever, but the point is you're up now. How do you get back to sleep?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. I mean, you can have a phone on airplane mode, or if you have some old extra phone that you don't use. I mean, certainly don't have your phone that's connected to the internet by your head for a bunch of different reasons, right? But if you have some audio device, I do find that playing audio in the middle of the night can be really, really helpful. It's just soothing. And generally try to find some British narrator because they tend to put me back to sleep more easily. So that's the one thing. I mean, obviously there's all the different breathwork techniques that I think are important. That should be your first go-to. But I would also say there's nothing wrong with getting up. If you are really suffering and, you get into one of these anxiety loops, just get up and read. It's okay. Get up and read. Go to the kitchen, make a cup of herbal tea, get yourself out of the anxiety loop by actually, taking some agency and not just sitting there and stewing in your own juices.
Okay, beautiful. So the book is called Good Stress: The Health Benefits of Doing Hard Things, 10 Protocols to Extend Your Lifespan and Your Health Span, written by you and your wife, Skylar, co-author.
Yeah.
So you've been interviewed all over the place at this point. You have a course on Commune, which is your platform that helps people implement some of these things we've been talking about. And what are some other resources that you recommend for incorporating more good stress into your life?
Yeah. Well, for me, what I've been able to do is codify all of these good stress protocols in one place. But there are so many experts that go deeper into each one of them. And really, I'm just a distiller in many ways of information. You and I have had the great fortunate to be able to talk with brilliant people and tons of incredible doctors and experts. So, if you want to learn about sauna, maybe go check out Rhonda Patrick if you really want to go deep on that. If you want to go super deep on cold, Susanna Soberg or the Hoff daughters. Now, I just spent a week with them in Turkey, Isa and Laura Hoff, which are Wim's daughters, and they wrote a great book about getting cold, particularly for women. If you want to learn about fasting, check out Mindy Pels or Will Cole, Mindy particularly for women. So there's so many places I think that, you can go to get great information to go deeper on each one of these particular protocols. I think, where I try to be helpful is to provide a general bigger context for people to understand that there is a lot of benefit in doing the things that they tend to avoid. And I've certainly noticed that in my life. And, I'm not that different than a lot of people. So
beautiful. I think you made it really accessible and relatable. And so thank you so much for that.
Yeah, brother. Thanks so much. I appreciate you.
Awesome, man. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you resonated with this conversation and you want more, start by checking out this one. And otherwise, we've got an entire playlist of similar conversations. So make sure you're subscribed and please leave a comment letting me know which other guests you'd like for me to interview on this channel.